Hey guys, it's Frederik from the FWX podcast. I've been talking quite a bit about certain concepts and terminology and certain names in when it comes to storytelling and stories and world building. And I did that by the hands previously with this show, Game of Thrones. But now I want to talk about a more specific kind of thing that is actually huge in of itself, and that is superheroes. That's exactly the superhero genre, because has become huge over the past 25 years, and before too, but especially these last 25 years. And there's many different concepts to be talking about superheroes. And the thing I want to start with right now is the many kind of differences that there are. And I'm gonna do that in a moment, but first, if you like this kind of content, you can like the video, you can subscribe to the channel for more content. I'm gonna bring up a bunch of names that I've talked about when it comes to especially Marvel. I haven't talked about DC yet on the podcast. And also important to know, I'm not a native English speaker, so if you find me fumbling over a word, that's pretty normal for me. Also, I might swear as well, and know that that is normal for me. And I'm sorry if that offends you, but it's likely going to happen. Okay, let's talk about superheroes and all their differences, of course. And the one I want to talk about first is one that both major companies, because when people think about superheroes, they think either the DC content or the Marvel content. But of course, there are more superhero comics. I should mention that here also. Most of these um, digital content when it comes to superheroes are based on the comic books from those companies. When it comes to DC or to Marvel, and you can see that I'm waving, of course, because I'm pointing to pictures of those superheroes and those characters from those mythologies. I'm using mythology here as a term in of itself because it basically trying to find the right word here. Um, hmm. What I really mean is that it implies that there is much lore about it. So, a lot of background information about those characters because we've been absolutely over we've been very much exposed to a lot of superhero content the last, especially the 25 years that have passed in our 21st century. But of course, these things came from somewhere before, so they were made mostly in the 20th century. But in our last 25 years, they've absolutely accelerated when it comes to content about these heroes and assassins and super soldiers and billionaires that turn into heroes. And that's also the interesting part with DC and Marvel is that they kind of mirror each other and they got similar kind of characters. But that's not. I'm not trying to make this partisan, to be sure. I'm not going to polarize anyone here. That's not my goal here. I just want to talk about the specifics Of course, I'm talking broadly just now, but I'm gonna do more specific stuff in a moment. I'm just looking at these pictures and going, there's so much I could talk about. The one thing that I want to start with is that there are so many different things when it comes to the superhero genre. Also, things that rub into other genres as well. For instance, me personally, I love me a good sword fight. Or when it comes to historical movies, too. I'm especially a big fan of more sword based stuff and less about 20th century stuff. So, one of the places I think about when I'm saying those things is, of course, uh, ancient times and antiquity, which is more of the Roman times and the Hellenistic times, when things became more branded, let's say. They became more in of itself. There's kind of a levels of the when it comes to history, and all of us have turned this into a history lesson. There's a kind of tiers when it comes to, especially those younger years, the very first years. You got prehistoric, basically, and then we went to. I'm making a long thing out of basically saying that those old times are some of the most interesting times to learn about, especially when it comes to superheroes. And of course, there is one character that I've laid in that I got right here, a picture that absolutely follows, that absolutely comes from that time. And that is this woman, Wonder Woman, also known as Diana Prince. And we know her by those names, but originally when she was made, she is from an island called Themyscira, which was based in those archaic times. And because, as you can see here by her original outfit, she very much has the kind of uh, apparel of those old times. Of course, this is, of course, maybe a bit more sexualized version of it. So I'll put the picture back now. Because you can see clearly the braces and the long shoes and the almost like a crown, maybe, and then the body armor, of course. And so that's very much dependent on the time. Of course, when it comes to our more recent history, we know Diana Prince more better from those recent movies. Well, recent. They've been out for quite a couple of years now. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because Diana is very much a demigod, which is one of those differences I want to talk about. And so she has strength herself. I'm gonna bring this up just in case. Of course, if you follow what is happening right now when it comes to the DCU, the remake with James Gunn and his business partner Peter Safran at the helm, there's talks of them doing a new Wonder Woman movie with all those interesting characters. And there's also that Themyscira show that they're working on, of course. Um, but I want to point out right now is that being a demigod means that she has specific powers. And so she has superhuman strength, invulnerability, speed. She can fly. She heals pretty fast and is semi immortal. And so that gives her all the abilities that she can. Of course, one of the important things when it comes to being a superhero is that your uniqueness makes you who you are. And for her, that means using, for instance, the lasso of truth and being very set on excuse me, I just went silent there for a moment. What I mean, especially with her, is that she very much embodies being a demigod, which makes her a hero, a superhero in her own right. And because she has innate powers. Another person from that side, of course, with innate powers, is of course somebody that we recently newly see in superhero media, and that is of course Mr. Superman himself, Clark Kent, with the the Superman movie out in theaters in the cinema that you can go see, with David Cornsworth playing the character, of course. And the reason for him to be super, because Superman gets his powers from the sun, and which allows him to use the laser vision that he has, the icy breath that he can use, of course allows him to fly, of course, and also the standard superhuman abilities, super strength, invulnerability, being tough to take out, can endure quite a lot of damage, and a couple more things that are specific to him, which includes also a kind of looking through people. I'd call it X-ray, but that's not completely accurate either. And so, lots of new stuff about him, and so that's all very interesting, especially because the DCU, the new DCU, is full on in its New Year's. Well, basically, like a human, the DCU is very much in its baby to toddler phase. It is still growing right now, and they're fully on board to make it a full human, a full on franchise in itself. Of course, there have been tries with DC before. That includes somebody else that ties to another different kind of person when it comes to being a superhero, and of course that is someone the DCU is also going to cover, because they're currently in that discovery phase, basically, of who, what, when, where, and who will play this character. And of course, I'm talking about someone we've already seen in a different capacity when it comes to the DCU, but they're also in the discovery phase of this character. And of course, I'm talking about Batman, Bruce Wayne. And he's arguably, right next to Wonder Woman and Superman, the most well known character on their side. And just like Superman, there have been many iterations of him on screen, on the silver screen, in video games as well. And speaking of video games, they're also still making, as far as I know, that Wonder Woman game with Monolith Studios, I think it was, with the use of. So back to her again for a moment. They're still working on that game, I think, with the Nemesis system from the. I'm blanking on the damn name that they used in those Lord of the Rings movie games, which are based in Mordor, Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, and maybe they're still making it, maybe they're not. I don't know exactly, but I just thought of that when I was thinking of the games that Batman is in. Of course, there's the famous Arkham games that also includes Origins, by the way, and also many TV series and movies, and basically we've seen a lot of him. But then also it's interesting to go back and do those interesting new things. For instance, and the other version that I wanted to talk about is that right now they're busy working on a new version for the DCU, and there's also the Elseworlds version with Robert Pattinson as this guy, of course, within that universe, because it's seen as a different universe than the DCU, and so this guy is going to be back in some capacity. And also importantly, we need to talk about what he exactly is. I think the best way to talk about Batman is that he's very much a counterpart to someone on the other side when it comes to Marvel, but different in his style and fighting and with what he does. But in terms of personality, it's very much like this guy, Iron Man. And so they belong to a class I like to call, well, there's no specific name for this kind of person, but basically I'm a genius who also happens to have a lot of resources and money, and I want to fight crime, and I want to fight big conflict. And I think I'm better than anybody else. That's basically the class that they belong to. And so they're interesting when it comes to personality, of course. I've seen so many versions and content when it comes to Batman, especially the Nolan movies, The Dark Knights, the Batman Arkham games. In my case, when it comes to the shows for TV, is Gotham, which introduces a younger version of Bruce Wayne, and as he is in its very roots, so very much the origins of Batman, but also about all the villains that he has, and because he has an incredible haul of villains that he has to fight, and the same can be said for those other two DC characters. But when it comes to his villains, they're very much on par with this guy. Spider-Man has a tremendous amount of villains himself. In his case, they're kind of all themed like him in a animal-like version, while Batman, it comes very much closer to a personality and who you are and how deep and dark and desperate you can go. And that is very much like Batman, like Bruce Wayne, someone who's just so utterly broken on the inside, but still wanting to make the world a better place. In the sense of being a crime fighter. They call Batman, for good reasons, the Caped Crusader. Is one of his many nicknames. Of course, because he wears a cape and cowl and beats up thugs in the streets. Well, yeah. The same thing can be said for Spider-Man. Having to deal with a lot of villains, but then also a lot of criminals. And that's why they're both crime fighters. And actually, that brings me back to the differences that there are when it comes to the superhero genre. Because I said Superman and Wonder Woman and Spider-Man as well, they're pretty much those superheroes. They have abilities that they can use. That's not the case with this guy, with Batman. Like I said, he comes pretty close to Tony Stark, Iron Man, when it comes to personality. But he, besides his personality, is a vigilante. That means that he fights on his own. And that's actually also specific to his personality, too, because in the broader sense, eventually we do get to learn about the Bat Family, another aspect we're gonna likely see in the DCU and in the, I'm gonna call it the Pattinverse as well, because there have been talks about more villains and I'm missing the name for a moment. I'm talking about the director of the Batman movie. Gonna look that up for a second, just not to humiliate myself. Matt Reeves. I think you know why I couldn't get to get that name for a moment. Because I was also thinking about one of the actors that played Superman before, Christopher Lee Reeves. That's why I wasn't laying that connection. Okay, so Batman is very much a vigilante because of how he fights and how he's also not close with authority, or is close with authority. Some of his best allies are from there. For instance, James Gordon from the Gotham City Police Department, the GCPD, and brings me back to the series of Gotham. And yeah, Batman is a very interesting character when it comes to especially the deeper parts, the personality, the way in which he fights as well, because one of the things you learn about him is that he's a lifelong learner. He has studied so many different fighting styles and uses them a lot, resulting in him being one of the best fighters on the DC side. Of course, not on par with superhumans, or another term I'm going to use in a moment, beings like Superman and Wonder Woman and many of the villains that they face. And of course, I have to mention here, all three of those characters are part of the Justice League, along with many other characters, including some you see in that recent Superman movie. And the difference with Batman, of course, is that he has a continuity plan when it comes to his fellow Justice Leaguers. And yeah, I did say I wanted to talk about that other kind of difference. So DC has a term when it comes to a being someone with innate abilities, having superpowers, and that is called a metahuman. and that is something that they use themselves. And this is because they have a genetic variant called the meta gene. And this can be activated by accidents or intense psychological stress. And some of those powers include telepathy, flight, enhanced senses, telekinesis. And it can even change what they look like as well. And like I said, I was thinking about this when I was showing off Batman, because technically he could be just a meta-human, but he's also something else, an alien. He comes from a different planet, Krypton in his case. And another thing about Batman you have to know is that he also, well, I was just talking about the fact that he uses contingencies when it comes to, in case one of his fellow Justice Leaguers, like Superman for instance, are turned by their villains. And of course we know the big weakness of Superman. It's been used in many digital media and in the comics and in other places as well, kryptonite. And so reason why Superman is not a meta-human is because he's technically alien, being from another planet. And Batman is also interesting in this case because he's something a bit different than them. It's not just, he's not a person with innate abilities or superpowers, or has been born of a powerful god or something like that. No, he's what I like to call a hero. Well, he's super at being a hero. That's the difference here. He's just, although sometimes he is classified as a metahuman just because of how amazing he is at the job, at being a super hero. So, difference being he does not have certain abilities, but he's very much a self-learner. He learned himself how to fight. He learned himself to close off his emotions and train and fight, and in his case also love. And same could be said for Spider-Man, by the way. He's got a tremendous set of love interests that appear in many iterations of the character and all of his media content. It couldn't be said for Superman, for instance. He very much always has just one super love interest, and that is Lois Lane. Of course, we also seen that new Superman movie, and he's pretty much glued to her. He will always have one person that will always be there for him. And I say that because if you know the comics, you know that he loses his folks, but later on. Especially the father, John Kent. Sorry about the background noise. Yeah, so DC uses metahumans, which is a class in of itself. There are many villains and heroes as well that are metahumans. I think of the person, likely the fourth most well-known member of DC when it comes to the heroes, the Flash. He's specifically a metahuman. Uh, Speaking for myself, I have seen that show, the more present show with Grant Gustin as a character, and in which he is pretty amazing. Okay, let's talk. I talked a lot about DC now. I'm gonna talk about Marvel now. Like I said, Spider Man is very much a superhuman. He has innate abilities, he uses his webbing, and there's a similarity when it comes to him and Batman. They're both geniuses. That said a little less about Batman, of course, because he's more known for being a incredible fighter. Same to be said about Spider-Man, who has a myriad of fighting styles that he uses, which makes him very unpredictable. So you never see what he does coming, which makes him an incredible fighter in his own right. And being someone with innate powers, especially the webbing, is an enormous advantage. But then there's also that mind of his, because in the comics it's established that he's in fact a genius as well. Maybe not on par as the other superheroes, like well, I did show the other guy, of course, Mr. Iron Man, Tony Stark, very much portrayed as a genius, with an iron suit that he uses to get around and take out many villains, in his case. And part of the reason why I bring up him, and also another character that we've come to know intimately in the past couple of 25 years, is this one, Black Widow. And these two are especially resembled when it comes to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is arguably one of the biggest franchises in the world. And I've talked a lot about that on the podcast. And I will in the future too, because there's still more to come from them, especially now when it's getting very interesting with the way they're going, because they're about to do something that we've seen in the DCU before. I talked about the Flash just a moment ago, because that show with Grant Gustin was part of the Arrowverse. They did something that is interesting that we're about to see happen in Marvel, especially with the MCU, and that is a reboot of said universe. In the case of Marvel and the MCU specifically, a reboot of the whole universe, so they can start talking about new things like the X-Men and Deadpool's world, and also other characters we haven't seen yet, or some that are just beginning to see, for instance, like the Fantastic Four, Marvel's first family, and I did want to talk about differences when it comes to Black Widow. We mostly know her from the MCU, of course, and in fact, if you look good at this picture, kind of very much looks like the person that portrayed her in the MCU, that being Scarlett Johansson, of course, and her, what's the word? Her sister, I will say, Yelena Belova, who is a second Black Widow. But what I wanted to mention here is that she's neither. She's not a superhuman or a vigilante. She is an assassin initially. She does the dirty work. She does black ops, which is a whole different thing when it comes to being a different kind of hero. Of course, when it comes to the MCU, of course, is that she, what's the word, reforms into being a hero. and being an assassin is part of her backstory. A very interesting backstory, by the way. They have been doing a lot with. I've talked about on the podcast. I've talked a lot about, especially the Captain America side of things, which very much intercedes with her background. For instance, in the Winter Soldier movie, she and Captain America have that brief conversation where she talks about having had an altercation with the Winter Soldier before, so she's very much belongs to that world of being willing to do the dirty work, to kill people, to assassinate people. That's part of her background. The whole thing with her in the MCU is that she's trying to be better than that. And of course, spoiler alert if you didn't know this already, but she's no longer present in the MCU. Of course, you do have her sister, Yelena Belova, who is arguably one of the most interesting characters right now in the MCU, especially if you've seen the Thunderbolts movie, which I recommend you do. I saw it and I thought it was delightful. I've talked a lot about those things now. I'm checking. One more thing I want to mention here, and specifically when it comes to Marvel too, because, well, the next big thing we're gonna get from the MCU are the X-Men, and we've also gotten recently the Fantastic Four, which introduces us to a whole new thing. And what I mean to say here is there's a specific evolution of the humans in Marvel, because as it is explained to us, especially in, maybe you've seen the Eternals movie. I know it didn't do all that well at the box office, but when it comes to the movie itself, it's pretty good. I will mention purely for myself. My reasoning is that it sets up a template for the X-Men potentially. And that's also an important part of this, is that people with innate abilities or have a certain kind of gene, like the X gene for instance, is going to be implemented in the MCU, of course. And supposedly part of that is also the introduction that we've also already had of the Eternals and the Celestials and the Deviants. The Deviants being someone like Thanos, someone who stands out from the rest, especially in his case in appearance. And I wanted to mention that also, because of the way they've done this in the MCU, this is gonna lead to the X-Men. Because in the, I think it's Brave New World, I'm gonna check just to be sure. Yes, Captain America Brave New World, they introduce not only the Red Hulk, which is another evolution in some kind, but adamantium, which is what that island in that movie is made of. The celestial that gets stuck in the earth in the MCU is made of a specific kind of material, in this case adamantium, which originally is also the material that gets stuck into Wolverine, and he has those protruding things, those claws that he has are also adamantium. Not originally, because that's part of his story, is that as he is part of the Weapon X program, he gets injected with the adamantium, And again, I'm sorry for the background noise. And well, so it's all part of each other. So basically, is that we are going to see more of this in the MCU. Also, another important part is that you get those new terms when it comes to the MCU specifically, the anchor beings, the different kind of terms, the I remember that being brought up in the Deadpool and Wolverine movie. So, an anchor being is basically an individual whose existence is crucial for maintaining the stability of their universe. And specifically when it comes to Deadpool and Wolverine, it's Wolverine, of course. And also, here's another thing to consider that is also part of this whole being different. The MCU has introduced us to a specific thing called a variant. That being someone from a different timeline who made a change that resulted in them being different from other versions of that character. And the Deadpool and Wolverine movie is all about that. And the Doctor Strange 2 movie, Multiverse of Madness, introduced us to that idea. And besides how you feel about how those movies were, they were in itself pretty good. Of course, some things should have been better, of course. They did say that they didn't watch WandaVision before making Multiverse of Madness, which is a shame. But in my humble opinion, it's still quite good, Multiverse of Madness. The reason for me, and I'll go deeper into this when I talk about this on the podcast about Multiverse of Madness. The reason why it still holds up for me is that because I see a lot of Lord of the Rings things in there, which is another movie franchise that I love and hope to talk about one day. Okay, I feel like I have told you enough about all the different kind of heroes that there are in the superhero genre. Of course, there's one huge factor I'm gonna have to talk about in the next video or following video. That is the villains. I've talked a lot about the heroes. I also need to talk about the villains. Maybe one last thing to say before I end this episode is that I've talked all about all these heroes, and also with me talking about the variants, of course you have to think about the fact that there are villain versions of them too. For instance, when DC introduced new universes and other versions of those characters, that turned out to be the key in for them to make their heroes also villains, which is also an aspect we're gonna see with Marvel next. Because, well, if you've seen the footage from Comic-Con last year, is that the person playing Tony Stark initially, Robert Downey Jr., is now also going to portray Doctor Doom. And there have been reports that likely he's going to have a team of antagonistic heroes that help him out. And potentially those could be other former Avenger actors as well. For instance, there have been reports that maybe Chris Evans would come back to portray his role in a new light. And I think I've also heard something about a Black Widow as well. We might see her in a new version. Of course, people are all about to bring Spider-Man back up for just another moment, because they're in the middle of making the new movie, of course, Brand New Day. And there've been some reports about that maybe we're gonna see a villain. Well, no, that's not a report. That's just me trying to point out that maybe I would just love to see an interesting take on Spider-Man in a villain role. I think that will be incredible to see, and I think I'm gonna keep it at that. So thank you very much for listening to all of this. And before I go, I want to ask you, if you like this kind of content, please like this video. You can also subscribe to the channel for more content like this. And you can share this with friends and family and people online. You can also comment if you like. And I will see you in the next video. This is the FWX podcast. And I will see you next in the next video.